Good morning. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm very pleased today to welcome you for an important online discussion about the role of parliamentarians in atrocity prevention. Very pleased on behalf of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. I'd like to thank my colleagues Jones Nebley and Lauren Salim and Marie Lamanche for helping organize this. And particularly would also like to thank Parliamentarians for Global Action, a partner of Migs that we've worked with in the past, for being a co-sponsor of this event. As some of you might know, parliamentarians have an important role to play in preventing mass atrocity crimes, but very often they're underutilized or overlooked. So we're going to have a really in-depth discussion with three fantastic speakers about what can be done, what's the role of parliamentarians, what power and policies they can put in place, and talk about some of the general cases of concern where we see massive abuses of human rights around the world in 2021. So today I'm going to introduce in the order of speaking. So our first guest is Lieutenant General Roméo Dallaire. General Dallaire is Migs' Distinguished Senior Fellow. He's the founder of the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. He was the force commander of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda during the genocide in '94. And he is a former senator of in the Canadian Senate. Followed, we have Alice Nderitu. Alice is the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. She's an Under Secretary General of the United Nations, and Alice has worked long on peace building and protecting human rights across the African subcontinent internationally. So we're very glad to have Alice join us today. And followed by Alice, we'll have David Donner-Catin. David is a Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action. Migs has worked very closely with David in the past, particularly for the Milan Forum on preventing violent extremism and mass atrocities. So we're very pleased to have all three of them join us today. Now I would like to pass the floor to General Dallaire. General Dallaire, you, as becoming appointed a senator in 2007, you formed the all-party Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide within the Canadian Parliament. So I think it'd be a great time to have you take the floor and talk about your views on why parliamentarians have a role to play in atrocity prevention and what can be done.
Thank you very much, Kyle, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is one thing to witness a genocide and to be engaged in it, and another thing in the post-genocide to discern opportunities that have been lost, and in fact, a catastrophe that actually happened that might have been avoided if there had been an engagement by nation states to want to solve the problem and not just the UN as such. But in that assessment, there is a very specific arena that never seems to have come to the fore enough to influence public opinion, influence the legislative dimensions of parliaments, and ultimately hold legislative elements and parliament and the state accountable for deciding to or not to engage in the prevention of mass atrocities, let alone the intervention when we know things are already ongoing and catastrophic. And so I've been quite involved when I became a senator in taking up some of the initiatives that people were working on mass atrocity prevention, like Kofi Annan had set up an advisory group, of which Gareth Evans, Madame Ogata, Desmond Tutu, myself, we were involved in looking at how we could influence and provide input to the Secretary General. And one of the things we did see was the ability to get into a country early, very, very early, with maybe a small flag, not a big flag, a small flag, and start influencing that country in regards to potentials of scenarios going to mass abuses of human rights and mass atrocities. And at the time, we were looking at eminent persons, but I then turned very much to the fact that why aren't more legislators getting involved beyond their borders to engage? let alone inside. So I see us being involved outside, yes, beyond the nation, as the part of the legislative branch, not the executive branch. And also I see very much inside. Inside, there is a need amongst the different parliaments, of course, to bring far more coalition and be able to interface in a way by establishing deliberate focal points in the legislative groups that could, in fact, create a network of communicating focal groups in regards to mass atrocity prevention. We've asked governments to do it, but why aren't legislators engaged in also having that sort of thematic very much part of their role, both in an advocacy role, but also in influencing public opinion and engagement? We do have special privileges. We have the ability to communicate with the population. We have a privileged position in regards to the public and the media. We have a voice individually as parliamentarians within our own countries to be able to express it and demonstrate the courage and determination to do that. However, trying to do it as an individual is sometimes very difficult, and that's where I turned to the Montreal Institute of Genocide Studies at the time when I was a senator and said I wanted to create an all-party, both houses, genocide prevention group. That is to say, a grouping of legislators that would sit and meet on occasion, which was about every 6 weeks or so, and we would educate, we would inform, we would pass on information, to pass that information not only to those who were attending these meetings, but all the legislative branch of the governments. And in so doing, we were able to build a cohesive entity that ultimately kept feeding, educating, informing the legislators of these matters and attracting their attention by them and their staffs and educating them on what was going on. I think that the two things that I would like to bring forward is one, that we should have focal points within our legislative bodies that are concentrating on particularly this subject of mass abuse of human rights based on the R2P demands, based on the will to intervene work that we did, based on the need to prevent conflicts and conflicts going to genocide. And the other side of that is that the parliamentarians amongst themselves group and feed each other this information, educate, and they become activists in their communities, but mostly in their nation, by having such privileged access to media, to public opinion, to a position of prestige to which people expect them to express themselves and not simply be the voices of the party. So that's a short burst of which a general and a senator are not used to brevity. And so I'll start with that anyways. Thank you.
Thank you, General Dallaire. And I think it's a nice transition because I think when you were in the Genocide Prevention Group, twice the past UN Secretary General Special Advisor on Genocide Prevention came to Canada and actually met and spoke at the group, both Francis Dieng and Adama Dieng. So it's now, we're almost like a virtual GPG we have here today. So I'd like to pass the floor to the new Special Advisor on Atrocity Prevention, Alice Nderitu.
Thank you very much, Kyle, for this opportunity to sit on this panel. So Excellencies, distinguished colleagues and dear friends, and thank you to the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. And I must first start by saying that it's an honor, a real honor, to be in the presence of General Dallaire, and we can't thank you enough for what you did and what you continue to do to prevent genocide in the world. So, and we know that atrocity prevention is a global and collective agenda for which all national and international actors have a role to play. And when I was preparing this, I was thinking about parliaments and how they're made up of politicians, and how historically identity has always been an important rhetorical resource, often used for nationalistic purposes as a political value. So, in knowing how often people get away with identity mobilization on the basis of nationalism, then I asked myself, how do parliaments lead the way in showing that identities and differences need not always lead to violence? And I ask this because history teaches us that politicians mobilizing on the basis of identity can be a precursor to the commission of atrocity crimes. We saw that in Rwanda, we saw that in Srebrenica, that dehumanization of the other led by politicians was present long before violence broke out and atrocity crimes were committed. So parliaments have many roles. Of course, they can identify ways in which governments and institutions can intervene at the early warning signs of potential violence, and then link that to early action, which is so important, by calling for decisive action before atrocities begin. Parliaments can call on their governments to criminalize genocide denial and to bring genocide perpetrators to trial. They can call for full cooperation on the issue of genocide deniers and perpetrators who are still at large and who use social media platforms to spread hate. They can propose and lead advocacy for the establishment of an annual parliamentary debate on atrocity crimes prevention, or even the establishment of parliamentary committees on atrocity prevention. Parliamentarians can also integrate atrocity crimes prevention in the development and adoption of relevant legislation. This would be legislation, for example, related to criminal accountability and redress for past and present atrocity crimes. So that, for instance, parliaments have a role to play in states' adoption of very critical international instruments, such as the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which I'm working so hard to get more states to ratify, or even the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And beyond criminal accountability, there are so many other transitional justice measures, especially in post-conflict societies, which are often part of negotiated peace agreements that require parliamentary adoption or ratification. And parliaments are also central to monitoring status of this ratification and implementation of core instruments of international human rights. So I would just like to stop by saying that parliaments, there are so many things that parliaments can do, but they can also pose questions to members of the executive, including to heads of governments or states, on actions taken to fulfill duties to prevent atrocity crimes. They can raise questions about the role of institutions such as peace-building commissions, national human rights institutions, ombudspersons in supporting atrocity crimes prevention. They can develop proposals for strengthening this role when needed. And they can also ask of such institutions to provide briefings, publish reports on atrocity crime risks, or include specific consideration of risks within reports, or even provide recommendations on steps needed for atrocity crimes prevention, including on strengthening inhibitors of atrocity crimes. So I'd like to stop here, and then we can engage further later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alice. Now I would like to pass the floor to David Kaye, the Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action.
Thank you very much, Kyle, and it's always a big pleasure for me to be with you at Concordia University for the fantastic job that the Montreal Institute is doing all the time. And to be honest, for me, it's quite an emotional meeting because I was in Arusha in 1995, setting up in my previous capacity the Arusha School on International Criminal Law, International and Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, as a way to integrate African young lawyers and senior law students into this global movement for the fight against impunity. And in the first day of the first session of this school, which lasted for 3 years until 1998, the first document we analyzed was a fax signed by General Roméo Dallaire, in which he asked the United Nations Department for Peacekeeping Operation and the member states in the council through that department to give him a mandate that could have helped him to try to prevent a genocide that then eminent scholars and researchers describe as a preventable genocide. So I know that General Dallaire have done a lot in this field, and I want to really pay a tribute for his legacy and his incredible commitment. Today, Parliamentarians for Global Action is honored by the fact that the chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Genocide Prevention in Canada, Honorable Ali Essassi from the House of the Commons, is also a PGA board member. He was elected in Kiev in 2018, and his mandate has been renovated, and he's providing enormous leadership in our organization, especially as a son of immigrants from a country, Iran, that is plagued by totalitarianism and gross human rights violations. I'm also very happy to be today for the first time in a panel with the new special representative of the UN Secretary General for the Prevention of Genocide, Ms. Nderitu, because her mandate is crucial to make sure that the organization remembers what has been set up to, which is, yes, to prevent World War III, but also to restore international peace and security. Can there be international peace and security in the face of mass atrocity? It can't. Mass atrocities, by definition, they pose a threat to the peace. They can even breach the peace because of the repercussions that they have, these mass atrocities at the domestic, but also regional, cross-regional, and global level, as we see with the influx of refugees, and her mandate is therefore absolutely essential. As every academic meeting, because Concordia, after all, is a university, I want to contribute to it also by giving to the participants some sort of readings to be made to learn more about this. And the first reading that I would recommend, it's about what do we mean by the terms atrocity preventions. And here I'm happy to point out to the old but still good responsibility to protect document that the International Commission set up by the Canadian government did at the end of the 90s, which led to the notion of responsibility to protect. Regarding the role of the parliamentarians, we certainly have put together, on behalf of PGA, but above all, thanks to the leadership of the Montreal Institute, an handbook on preventing mass atrocities and violent extremism, which was put up a few years ago. It's still available online. It's a free publication, and it gives really a full-fledged toolbox of types of interventions that parliamentarians can undertake. And I will not repeat what so eloquently the General and Ms. Nderitu already said. But there is one issue I want to focus on, which is impunity. Impunity for the atrocities of the present and of the past is fueling the atrocities of tomorrow. When Adolf Hitler was confronted in one of his first cabinet of the Third Reich in Berlin with a question from one of his ministers who said, is this final solution compatible with international law? Wouldn't we have consequences if implemented? And apparently the Führer said, this is documented in of course, a document, said, who remembers about the Armenians after all? What happened to the Armenians, we are aware of. It was a genocide in the current terms. Of course, the convention came into being in 1948, but there were already widespread and systematic massacres that were in violations of the Hague Convention of 1907 and other instruments of international humanitarian law. So they were still mass atrocities done with complete impunity, because the second peace treaty after World War I gave a total blanket immunity and impunity to the leaders of the Ottoman Empire in the name of realpolitik. So this lesson was learned after World War II, but has been not yet learned enough for what we have been watching today, repeating again and again. And I think the most credible response to the absolute imperative to end impunity comes from the Rome Statute of the ICC, which is the third book that I have here, maybe in an old version, but it's amended with the Kampala amendments on the crime of aggression. And I think what the missing link is for us today is the universality of this court. The main superpowers have not yet agreed to be bound by the jurisdiction of this tribunal. And they have applied a principle of selectivity that is really unacceptable, and it's undermining the rule of law. The rule of law is based on the equality of all before the law. So we need to make it crystal clear that if you commit a genocide, you will be punished. So the cost of the atrocity is higher than the benefit that you will have by remaining in power. Not forever. There is no immunity. There is no functional immunity for this crime. When Adolf Hitler committed it, he was a criminal and he should be brought to justice. Committed suicide, so he couldn't be brought to the Nuremberg tribunal. But that's the reality of every totalitarian dictator, or every rebel leader, or every head of a terrorist organization, of every individual, regardless of his or her nationality, who would like to commit these crimes. We need to make them costly. We need to make them difficult. We have to do that with the political will. And the place where the people are represented are the parliaments. So parliamentarians are the representative of the people if they are elected democratically. And this is the best place where to create a global consensus against impunity and for the prevention of mass atrocities.
Thank you, David, for those comments and for sharing both the original report, the R2P report, and also for mentioning the handbook on preventing violent extremism atrocities that we produced together a couple of years ago. So we'll share that online and with the guest after, and also share it on Twitter. I would like to maybe now turn to a general discussion. So we have a good number of people following us. People are starting to pose questions, but I'm going to hold off a few more minutes before taking those. But I would like to turn the table, because I think there's a key element from our work at Migs that we know the UN has a key role in preventing atrocity crimes, but very often the UN doesn't have all the tools or the support it needs to do so. And I'm wondering, maybe starting with John Dallaire, if you could think about what could parliamentarians do to support the UN with the goal of preventing mass atrocity crimes. Floor is yours, General Dallaire.
Yeah, there is the UN Parliamentary Association that exists, but I am of the school that although parliamentarians first and foremost are responsible for the safety and the continued well-being of their citizens, the ones they represent specifically, individually, and of course as a global body, their nation, there is a requirement that we must go beyond our borders, because we now have a generation that's global. The under 25, the generation without borders, they're already operating globally through the revolution of communications, and so we've got this ability to influence youth into moving into the realm of the globe, of the whole of humanity. And so human rights to them is the whole of the world. It's not just a local and national affair. That's why parliamentarians should have an eye beyond their borders in regards to not only human rights, because they usually have a committee on that, but on how nations fall into catastrophic failure, imploding, and then ultimately not see early warning signs nor intervene in them to ultimately see mass atrocities and genocide. That angle of humanity that is so much of a source of the frictions inside of nations, let alone regions, that side simply doesn't seem to come to the fore on the legislative side. It does, committee discussions and committee meetings that exist for legislative work, but you don't see that becoming a dynamic force. And because of that, it doesn't seem to have a reach into the UN to hold the UN not only accountable, but engaging it in wanting to bring solutions. You know, Kofi Annan had 68 countries sign up to provide troops should a atrocity scenario present itself. It was after the Cambodian affair, of course. And when he called on countries to provide support, political, resource, military also, all of them refused. How can the then executive get away with signing up to something and then not doing it? It's only because the legislative is not holding him accountable. And if without those focal points and without a construct within the legislative group, we won't get that input. And they can't do it unless they're educated and engaged beyond their borders in things that will be ultimately a risk to them, because catastrophes that happen in other countries will migrate to our countries through refugees, through rage in these camps that turn into extremism and terrorism, through diasporas that get locked in and get engaged in it. And we saw it in Toronto a few years back when the Tamils stopped traffic because they didn't like what the Canadian government was doing. Legislative bodies have got to be more proactive and engaged in the international sphere that will bring influence on the country.
Thank you, General Dallaire. I'd now like to pass to Alice, and particularly to have your thoughts, Alice, on how parliamentarians can either work or advocate to support the UN, particularly your office, because your office, I understand, does important work, but there's sometimes you don't get as many resources that are required. So I'd like to maybe get your thoughts on how parliamentarians around the world could support the UN and the important work that you do.
You are right in terms of not getting support in some of these cases. We have to, when violence is about to begin or when it has already begun, so much work rests within our office in terms of verifying what is going on the ground. And it would be a really good thing if national parliaments can explore opportunities to conduct regular atrocity risk assessments and report on them. And and they can do this by proposing that this can be undertaken by government, by peace building commissions or national human rights institutions, or any or academic civil society initiatives to reflect on national risks. And for example, right now, as we speak in Ethiopia, we've been engaging the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission in terms of working together with us in developing a framework of analysis for the prevention of atrocity. And we already have our own framework of analysis, but we were asking them to draft a contextual framework of analysis, and that would be very useful. And that's one thing that Parliament can push national institutions to do. And then the other thing that I have seen even before I began working in this particular office is how underfunded atrocity prevention measures are. And the national parliaments can raise questions in budget debates about the allocation of resources for atrocity prevention. And I've also noticed that often when you're speaking about atrocity prevention, there's a tendency to mainstream. And when you mainstream something, then like atrocity prevention, then you lose it because nobody is accountable. So very important for parliaments to not only raise these questions in budget debates, but also make decisions in terms of allocation of money. And they can even ratify the proposal of the national executive or even rectify when necessary. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. So I think a key lesson is that parliamentarians can lobby, act, and call on governments to support the UN in your office, and that's politically, financially. I think there's more support, and I would argue even in Canada, the atrocity prevention community is underfunded. There isn't a lot of money for think tanks and organizations working on this, so we have to, nationally in Canada, we have to pick the game up, but also internationally. I'd now like to turn to David. David, you talked a bit about the ICC, but could you reflect perhaps on what the PGA is doing to support the UN and what some of your individual members are doing to support the UN multilateralism to prevent atrocity crimes?
Yes, Kyle, and of course, what I also said before is that I agreed with those who spoke before me. So if you make me speak the third, then they always have, and you have such incredible speakers, they already cover the topic very well. And let me maybe summarize what Parliamentarians of Global Action is also trying to do in our modest capacity. After all, we are the largest network of individual parliamentarians in 136 countries. And certainly our biggest campaign has been historically since 1989, the creation of a permanent international criminal jurisdiction to make the promise of Nuremberg permanent and viable. And we still continue to believe that the real problem is that there is not an international rule of law. We have a domestic rule of law. So if I want to commit an atrocity in the United States or in my own country of nationality, Italy, I will go to jail. But if I am an head of state and I'm planning to do this type of thing, maybe I can have a number of variables that can determine whether this plan is possible or not in the mid-long term. And the lesson learned from the mass atrocities in the Darfur region of the Sudan is that sooner or later, your people will remove you from power if you are such an abusive and, of course, suspected criminal head of state, because of course Mr. al-Bashir is protected by the presumption of innocence and he has the right to a fair trial. But the pressure was mounting from many sides, and this included, of course, the Darfuri diaspora in the war, the victims, and the international community that united themselves around their cause. And then finally, in 2019, Mr. Bashir, after 13 years that he had been indicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity and 12 years of indictment of genocide, he was removed from power. Now he's in jail. He's being tried for corruption crimes, but hopefully soon he might also be prosecuted and tried for genocide and other mass atrocities. As the case may be, parliamentarians have an essential role to play, because for years and years they have defended that process. For example, through PGA, they spoke in the Consultative Assembly of Parliamentarians on the ICC and the rule of law, and our meetings, defending the prosecutor and the court from any type of efforts to politically assassinate the court. This came from the Sudan, came from the African Union, came from other powers. And the African parliamentarians, more than 450 members of PGA, said, no, not only we want this case to go forward, we want more cases in Africa and more cases wherever these atrocities are committed. So changing the paradigm of impunity and creating an international rule of law as we have it domestically will completely change the landscape, which are making mass atrocities almost impossible in a functioning democracy. And here also, in terms of prevention, what are the root causes of most of the atrocities today? So this is also a responsibility for parliamentarians. One of them is certainly ideology, because it was in the name of the ideology of the National Socialist Party that it happened what it happened in Europe and the rest of the world in the 1940s. And it's in the name of the ideology of ISIS or Daesh what happened in Raqqa, Mosul, and the regions, the territories occupied by the so-called self-proclaimed Islamic State, which is anti-Islamic and anti-state. And you have so many other situations where in the name of an ideology, mass atrocities are perpetrated. So the role of parliamentarians is to debate, where is the ideology coming from? Who is supporting it? Where are the funds coming from to support schools or charities or educational establishments in which these ideologies are taught? Now we have, for example, a major initiative by a member of parliament in Afghanistan denouncing the fact that the Taliban are still enslaving children who are then sent into certain schools on the other side of the border in Pakistan to be indoctrinated and then come back to Afghanistan as sons and daughters of the jihad in the name of anti-religious interpretation of Islam that creates martyrs, that destroys communities and targets civilian victims of the armed conflict. So this is going on today, and somebody is funding these schools, maybe from Saudi Arabia, maybe from the other private entities around the world, and this has to stop. Similarly, in the name of other ideologies, other atrocities are committed in the name of fundamentalist Christianism. The Lord Resistance Army enslaved also children and did what it did in northern Uganda, and now they are in Central African Republic. We also have regimes that are utilizing mass violence and mass atrocities to perpetrate their power. These are sovereign states. So that you have heads of states traveling, they could be arrested and prosecuted. But in the UN, there is a very retrogressive debate on the fact that they would be covered by immunities when they travel. So there is a lot to be done for parliamentarians as oversighters of the executive power to tell their government, take the position that is necessary at the UN, and as General Dallaire said, make your act consequential to your international legal obligations. If there is also the need to deploy ground troops, because drones don't control territories. So if you want to stabilize a region and bring back the rule of law, you need policemen on the street. Who's going to give them if the territorial state is collapsed and vanished? So there is an enormous work to do. We have to go back to the ABC of the UN Charter. And I think it's unpopular and inconvenient in many cases, but we will never give up.
Thank you, David. And I just put on the screen here, for those who want to see the report, the handbook for parliamentarians on violent extremism, atrocity prevention that we produce with PGA. It's the link here. We'll share it with everyone by email, but it's a good step about what to deal with non-state actors like ISIS and those groups that David was talking about. So I'm going to pose one last question before we turn the audience. I'm wondering if, and I'll start in the same order with Joan Dallaire and then Alice and David, but I'm wondering if are any new tools or new models that you think need to be scaled up. So I'll give an example. There's been a lot of focus lately on Magnitsky sanctions, where parliamentarians are working to impose targeted economic sanctions against individuals responsible for atrocity crimes. Is this something that can be, it's a new tool that can be considered? And new models, the All-Party Group for Prevention of Genocide in the Canadian Parliament. There's also one in the UK Parliament. And is this something that could be useful for parliamentarians around the world to develop and work on? So Joan Dallaire, let's start with you and think about new tools and new models. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I thank you very much, Kyle, because that is exactly what is needed, is the creation of a new capability within the legislative branch to be able to not only engage, but build momentum within it to influence ultimately the executive branches of their own countries, and ultimately be able to coalesce with other parliaments that may have a similar desire to bring about pressure and public opinion even in regards to preventing mass atrocities or genocide, or holding individuals accountable for having conducted such actions, and reinforcing indirectly, yes, I agree with David, the International Criminal Court. But let me give you two examples of how they can do things like this. We in Canada, we know there are genocidaires that have not been arrested, that they exist, and we only got arrested one who was brought to trial in Canada and the trial cost nearly $2 million. And when I queried why there was no more actions taken on the impunity side of the house inside our own country, where the law permits us now, of course, to hold these people accountable and try them in our country for actions they've taken elsewhere, they said they just didn't have the resources. So one aspect is, do you, as parliamentarians, keep an eye on such nuances of resource allocation by your country to the, let's say, the international section on your Justice Department in bringing people to court and holding them accountable? The other one is the follow-up on that. The follow-up on the Arusha tribunal, where we've had people who were sent to jail for life, are now getting being able to leave after a number of years, some 14, some 20 years, 25 years of being in jail. I testified there because first, it didn't have capital punishment. I didn't want that. There's no way. But second, it had life sentences. That meant that the person spent life in prison and was buried in the prison graveyard if necessary. That was critical to hold people accountable ad vitam aeternam. We can coalesce movements like the GPG that we have in Canada and coalesce with others like we tried with the British, and that's still floating, bringing other parliaments together, create focal points on specific agendas like this amongst the legislative group, and nurture it and feed it by individual parliamentarians and their staffs getting engaged and educate your colleagues.
Thank you, General Dallaire. So I'd now like to turn to Alice, but thinking also about new tools, new models, I'm also reminded, Alice, that your office with the UN Secretary General has passed a roadmap for dealing with hate speech, and I'm not sure if governments and parliamentarians are supporting that. I'm wondering if there's something that you could discuss on that issue.
Thank you. I'll start with the tools, and then I'll get to the strategic plan for the prevention of hate speech. So the pandemic has changed many things, the way we do things. It has changed quite a number of the tools that we used to use. And it has also connected us in a completely different way. And I'm thinking of when previously, one of the things that I did was work with a few friends to set up an early warning platform that linked early warning and early response. And we used a mobile phone. We did a study of how many mobile phones there were at that time in Kenya, and how they were used and the methods of using them. And then because most of the mobilization for violence was done through the cell phone, then we decided to use the cell phone for the same, to do the opposite. If people are mobilizing for violence with the cell phone, then we use it to mobilize for peace or to de-escalate violence. So in terms of new tools, we are still at that point where we are not engaging local communities enough. We still have lots of top-down approaches in terms of atrocity prevention, and that also includes the parliamentarians that we are speaking about today. Lots of top-down approaches, yet so much information can come from the ground that we are not tapping into. And for example, when we were working with the mobile phones, we distributed very many mobile phones, and we would tell people, just look through the window and tell us what you're seeing. And then they would tell us, okay, this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing children not going to school. I'm seeing people standing in small groups. And of course, all those become risk factors indicating potential for violence and ultimately atrocity crimes. So in terms of tools, I can say that right now, many people can't travel around the world, but we've been able to meet a lot of people virtually. Actually, people we would never have been able to meet, or that would have needed different circumstances to meet in terms of getting there, flying and everything. And right now we were having a conversation with some African women, and we've realized that since the pandemic started, there are so many local communities, women in local communities, who've been involved in very high-level meetings because they can connect virtually. So this is a tool that we need to fine-tune further in terms of what we can do with it in terms of preventing atrocities. And how we can then establish contacts with parliamentarians from different countries and in regional organizations, so that they can maintain mutually supportive networks with these local communities and forge relationships with people and parliamentarians, for example, in countries facing atrocity crimes, and then support them through exchanges of good practices. So quite a bit needs to be done in terms of exploring not the negatives of the pandemic, but is there any positive that the pandemic has brought to us? So conversely, to answer your second question, the COVID-19 pandemic has actually exacerbated existing trends of hate speech that actually scapegoat and stigmatize individuals or groups along identity lines. And this is true everywhere in the whole world. And our office, in 2019, the Secretary General launched the UN Strategy and Plan of Action on hate speech. So my office, the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and Responsibility to Protect, is a UN focal point on the implementation of this strategy and plan of action. So the document contains 13 commitments, and it's very comprehensive because it calls for enhancing UN efforts to address the root causes of hate speech, including marginalization, discrimination, exclusion, inequality, poverty. It's very, very, very broad, and lack of basic education. Has it been well received? Yes, we've been working. We have a two-pronged approach. So working with resident coordinators, UN resident coordinators in each country, so that they mobilize people in that country to develop their own strategic action plan. And quite a number have been developed. We have one in Ukraine, we have one in Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, in Sri Lanka, in quite a number of countries. And the other approach is to actually work with communities and ask them to develop their own strategy, plan of action on hate speech, to combat hate speech within their communities. We have right now one that is happening as we speak in Nigeria, and it's been very, very eye-opening to see communities framing for themselves what they think hate speech means and what they think hate speech that leads to atrocities, how it looks like and what can be done about it. To watch them trace stereotypes and where they came from and became prejudices and became actual discrimination. It's been a very, very rich experience. So the UN strategy and plan of action contains many options in terms of addressing short-term dynamics, and including engagement with new and traditional media and using technology. And just a week ago, we had a series of conversations with the social media companies, the leadership of social media companies, YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. And we are working with them in terms of putting together hate speech plans of action on social media. So quite a bit is happening, Kyle, on the ground around this UN strategy and plan of action on hate speech. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Alice. We're doing a lot of work on online hate, so it's great to hear that you're leading that out of the UN in New York and with big tech in Silicon. I'd like to turn to David. David, maybe if you could just briefly comment on Magnitsky sanctions. I know you recently organized a session with former Member of Parliament Erwin Kotler on Magnitsky sanctions. Could you briefly talk about what these are and how they're a new tool?
Magnitsky sanctions are individual sanctions targeting the financial assets and also, to a certain extent, the international travel of individuals who love to be in power, have a lot of money, enjoy that power by being in the world scene. So by curtailing their access to bank accounts, Visa cards, MasterCard, and other financial tools that they might have, or by freezing their villas in Sardinia or in the Côte d'Azur or in other places, then you are really disincentivating their behavior that may be of sponsoring, financing, supporting mass atrocities in the countries in which they operate. So it has a value. It doesn't replace justice. It's not a form of punishment. It's a preventative measure. It's an executive measure. So parliamentarians have a very important role to play in bringing to the attention of the government, well, you have this individual or those individuals that allegedly are involved in this mass atrocity, and they have an interest in our country, in the European Union, in the United States, in Canada, in the UK. So intervene and do something, because we cannot be a safe haven for their vacations or things like that. So it has an impact, but it does not replace justice. That needs to be very, very clear. And also it needs to make sure that innocent people are not targeted, because we have seen some incredible mistakes, especially in the so-called global war on terror, which unfortunately is part of the problem of having created more hatred in the world and more mass atrocities in response to other mass atrocities. So it's a very problematic field, and there is not a silver bullet that will solve it. Our position on behalf of Parliamentarians for Global Action is that we need democratic renewal and human rights as a way to prevent. If human rights of all, including all the minorities, are respected, if there is a tight control on arms, whether they are small arms and light weapons, or whether they are weapons of mass destruction, which are prohibited in most frameworks, and absolutely prohibited in terms of the bacteriological, biological, and chemical weapons, then we are more safe and secure, and we can better prevent. So it's really a full toolbox of measures that needs to be there. Parliamentarians have a very important oversight function vis-a-vis the government. So the budget tool is very, very important to resource those institutions at the national level that are tasked with judicial, prosecutorial, and also educational preventative mandates against atrocities. The hate speech is illegal. You cannot hate and incite to violence, incite to genocide. Direct and public incitement to genocide is even punishable under the Genocide Convention and the Rome Statute. So we did a global code of parliamentary a global code of the democratic conduct that we addressed to all parliamentarians of the world, which is on our website, that really targets these fake news, false accusations, hate speech that may fuel the preparation of atrocities. And going to the point done so well by Alice on technology and the new opportunities that we have, there is one point that maybe I could make to integrate her excellent presentation, which is satellite imagery. So satellite surveillance would be extremely useful if done in a way that would photograph villages, communities, cities, when they're peacefully, when everything is working in a peaceful manner, and then making shots at the moment in which churches are burned, buildings are destroyed, what was there before and after the mass atrocities is perpetrated. In that way, we will help a lot to defray the costs at the international or domestic jurisdictional level, and also will send a signal to everyone that at least when it's not cloudy and when the weather allows, we will know exactly what was happening on the ground. We know that this technology exists. Unfortunately, only certain major powers have access to them. But what we need to do through the UN and other tools and our national parliaments is make sure that this technology is given for the purpose of atrocity prevention. And finally, parliamentarians are advocates. So if I can dissent on one point made here, I don't agree that parliamentarians are some sort of a top-down voice. If they are elected by the people, they are a bottom-up voice, because they are accountable to their constituents and they have to be re-elected the next times if they don't do a good job. So they are like every other person in society, bound by the rule of law, bound by the constitution. They have to be law-abiding, they have to be peace-loving, they have to serve the people under the constitution. So they are not bottom-up, they're not an elite. That's what they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be an elite. Unfortunately, to the contrary, those who commit mass atrocities are perceived to be part of an elite that is above the law. This is the perception. We have seen it in so many cases in Africa, in Asia, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America. And this is where we need to really change the policies of major international institutions. So parliamentarians can change domestic laws, but they also have to have a very strong oversight and impulse on the policies, on the foreign policies of their executives, so that international laws are enforced. And here, my request on behalf of PGA to the Special Representative for the Prevention of Genocide and Other Mass Atrocities at the UN is to ask the Executive Office of the Secretary General to include a very strong emphasis on prevention in the Our Common Agenda report that the Secretary General is preparing for the next General Assembly, mandated by the 75th General Assembly that last year, during the pandemic, nobody really, paid attention, but they issued a very good resolution calling for an assessment 75 years after the adoption of the UN Charter in San Francisco. So I think if every organization will become much more proactive, also at the domestic level, policymakers, especially parliamentarians, will be able to play a much stronger role.
Thank you, David. So we're almost at the end, and we had a lot of questions. I'm going to put one comment up on the screen. I'd like John Dallaire, Alice, and David maybe to just make a short statement on it, or whether they agree with it or not, or reflected by parliamentarians. But I'm going to put this up. So Mike, the idealist, and we need more idealists in the world, Mike, so I like your name. He says, too often when we talk about prevention, we're talking about immediate emergency level prevention. We need to look further upstream to truly prevent genocide and mass atrocities. What do you think of this? I think this is probably the best question we've received. Joan Dallaire, would you have anything to say on this?
I think the greatest weakness we have is early warning, and early warning of abuses of human rights that are evolving to the extent that they then can continue to degenerate either by the government or by non-state actors to the extent of being pushed to mass atrocities and even genocide. And this early warning can be how, in fact, societies are handling the fate of certain groups, of course. Darfur is a perfect example of that. But I see early warning also on how the women are being abused and how women can, in fact, find themselves caught up in the controversies of these complex scenarios in their societies, where ultimately they are subjugated to significant abuses of human rights. I think also the recruitment and use of children, how children are used, how they're treated, how they are they going to school, not what is happening to the children, and the use thereof. Those are early warning signals that yes, it can degenerate. And if you don't intervene at that time, then your prevention will be very difficult, because you probably will end up coming in too late, even after the scenario has exploded. So early warning instruments are critical.
Thank you, Joan Dallaire. Alice, would you have any closing comments on prevention? Oh, Alice, you're muted. If you could turn your...
Thank you. The question that was put out was very clear, because I think what Mike, the idealist, was saying, that we should look at the root causes of whatever is happening, that we shouldn't be addressing the tip of the iceberg. We should be looking at what's below the iceberg, or in Africa, where we don't have icebergs, we talk about crocodiles. The nose of the crocodile is what we are usually running towards, yet the whole body of the crocodile is under the water. So agree with you. Just this week, we completed an analysis, conflict analysis of countries in the world with our office, and looked at countries from the perspectives of prevention. And prevention cannot be just as a matter of emergency. There are some countries that do not need emergency prevention, but they are the countries that I would refer to them as countries that have fire without smoke. And when General Dallaire spoke earlier on about going in early and going in with a small flag, like a small flag at the beginning, That's what essentially he was speaking to the fact that we have to go upstream. We have to look more deeply in terms of what is this that is causing the issues that are going on the ground. And I think David too has spoken about addressing all these root causes of the ideologies. Where did they come from? Who created them? Who funds them? So really agree that prevention is never should be just an emergency measure. It's full time. It works all the time, and this goes against like some of the literature you'll often find, like even the literature on mediation, for example. Keeps talking about how conflict escalates and that there is a proper point for intervention. But really, in reality, when you're mediating, the entry points are everywhere, at every part of the conflict. So it's the same thing with atrocities, that at entry points are everywhere, in places where you do not see the issues manifesting, in places where you can already see issues already manifesting and coming out, and you're seeing things like demonstrations or open mobilizing, and in places where there is actually real atrocity. So prevention really is not an emergency measure, it's a full-time something that we should be doing from morning till evening every day. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. David, I turn to you for a closing comment or remark.
Thank you. And of course, they have said, Alice and General Dallaire, the perfect answers. What I can tell to Mike, the idealist, that if we live in a globalized world, we have globalization. That his name should be changed into Mike, the realist, because I fully agree with him. It's not about looking at the emergency. Then it's too late. Then the disaster is there. It's about creating a framework in which all human rights are respected for all. And when in a society, all human rights are respected for all components of that society, nobody will put justice in their own hands and use violence, express grievances, and bring about retaliation, hate, conflict, atrocity, renewed conflict, and so on and so forth. So the cycle of violence. So it's really commonsensical today in a globalized world not to be nationalist, not to be sovereignist, not to be unilateralist, not to be imperialist, not to be fundamentalist, not to be a violent extremist, but to be realistically idealist and accept all the human rights of all and create society based on the rule of law, the supremacy of the law. This is the biggest change we need, because unfortunately, international law is still governed by sovereign states who are putting before their national interest, and then they look at the international or globalized interest. The two must overlap and become one. In that moment, we can really be credible in atrocity prevention. Parliament has a fundamental role to play because there is a democratic deficit in the global community, but the day will come, because otherwise we are deemed for self-destruction. As we have seen it it was unimaginable a few years ago that the climate change approach would have been so unanimously agreed upon, now even with the United States rejoining and China being at the forefront. So things will also have to move forward on the so-called directly man-made catastrophes. Of course, also climate change is a man-made catastrophe, but it's indirect. We didn't think about the consequences of certain progress, but now we also have to face the consequences of the access to weaponry, like fully autonomous weapons, or what happened in between Armenia and Azerbaijan is really a revelation. You can win a war without soldiers on the ground and kill a lot of people and regain territory. So technology can change the contour of the perception of what should be done. And I would really hope that leaderships will change, and those who are irresponsible today will become responsible tomorrow and change what we are seeking as the real future for humanity, not an idealistic one, but a realistic one that will make us a viable planet for the future.
Well, with those closing comments, I'd like to thank Joan Dallaire, Alice, and David for joining us. Your comments were great. We're going to put this video online and also put it as a podcast so people can listen to it after. I would just like to thank the Parliamentarians of Global Action for being a promotional and partner for this event. And just last comments, and I'm sure Joan Dallaire, Migs, Distinguished Senior Fellow, agrees with me. Migs is welcome to be a partner working with PJ and the UN to increase the role of parliamentarians in the fight against mass atrocities. Thank you very much for joining us.